Cool. Okay. Thank you. Kia ora tātou. Can everyone hear me okay? Back. Good. So I've been given the big task of demystifying the blue economy in 10 minutes or 15 minutes or less. What I'll do is, I think we've got about 25 minutes for this session, and taking on board some of the comments from yesterday, I think it's important. Part of what I'll do is talk about what is it, what isn't it, that sort of thing. What the role of government is, I think, is really important for many in this audience. But also I want to make sure that I'll give you some practical examples of the sorts of things that are happening here in New Zealand at the moment, just to, I guess, keep it as grounded as I can so that people don't walk away thinking this is a theoretical concept, that there's a lot of real things happening across all fronts, lots of different scales and places. And also I think what's really important is recognise that there's no one definition globally of the blue economy. The definition we've got here is the one that Sustainable Seas uses. Most definitions, I think, are fairly consistent, even though they're not the same. So they all emphasise economic value, but also social and cultural and ecological well-being. They don't all, I think, in the context of the theme of today, which is also looking at restoration and protection, not all of the blue economy is specifically on that, but I'll talk, I think, more today about things that are relevant to that. Always now we're thinking about things, obviously climate change, waste and circular economy. We're thinking about multiple well-beings in the New Zealand context, obviously the role of Māori in both economic development, but also in that economic development that is enabling the contributions to cultural well-being and social and enhancing the Māori of the water. But recognise also, and everyone clearly already understands this, that it's ki utu ki tai. It's not just about the marine world offshore. It must also include the land as it impacts the marine environment. So the other two boxes I've got here are important. One of the things, and I think this theme will probably come through lots today, is that there are lots and lots of participants in the blue economy, and everyone has a role. I get so sick of hearing commentators around the place talk about government needs to fix it. Obviously government has a massive role, and I'll talk more specifically about that, but I'm a big believer that there is an awful lot of solutions that government can enable without it having to be government leading and or funding. The world of research obviously has a big role, and we'll hear more about that. Developers, people who are the entrepreneurs out there who are thinking out of the box, massively important role. And I think one that's misunderstood a lot in New Zealand, and perhaps slightly less so globally, but the role of finance, investment into the blue economy. And I think there'll be quite a bit more talk about that today as well. Overarching approach for the blue economy requires recognising and demonstrating and capturing what I've called here value from the blue economy. And one of the big things I think to take out of what I'm talking about is that there are some neat initiatives, and Revive Our Gulf was mentioned before as a great example of a great initiative, but they've got to be scalable in order to achieve the kinds of change that need to happen for restoration of damaged environments. And ideally they can be repeatable. And that's a big part of what, in an ideal world, we start seeing once we get more finance involved into the blue economy, is things that are both scalable and repeatable, so that you can learn the good lessons. You can also learn from areas that you've struggled, but be able to generate projects that can increase the scale of the restoration that needs to happen. This slide here, hopefully you can read it okay, but starting with, I just want to focus on the bottom part of that pyramid for a moment, and we've called it evolving, and that's really a lot of talk is happening about changing the existing economy. We might be talking about electric ferries, decarbonisation of the shipping industry, or ports, changing fishing methods, the growth of marine-based ecotourism, offshore aquaculture for things like seaweed, etc. These are all great projects, but they are simply, I think, they're doing things better than what is being done at the moment. For some sectors, I've called it evolve or die, or adapt or die. These sectors have no choice but to evolve, and in some areas we're probably a bit further behind the rest of the world, but this stuff is happening. It's happening too slowly for a lot of people. But really, it's the key takeaway of that bottom stuff is it's blue economy, but it's not necessarily restorative or leading to enhanced protection and the getting better of the environment and the social and the cultural well-being. It's simply doing things differently. The top two parts of it here, I think, are more interesting in the context of today. So that links back to restoration and regeneration, and how you can generate revenue from some of these types of projects. People talk a lot about things like blue carbon, for example, from seaweed. How can a project like Peter Miles with Revive Our Gulf, how can that generate revenue from bringing back the historic mussel beds in a way that enables it to grow and do more and more of the really great work that it's doing? So some of these sorts of things are really what comprise the emerging and the bit more out there stuff, the prospective stuff. So it's really, for me, the key things here, doing things completely differently, being innovative and taking chances and adapting in a way that does challenge the status quo. The balancing the relationship, and it's not just with the marine and coastal ecosystems, but it's also with the people who live there and who work there. Absolutely, it's protecting what's there now, but also I think the key of these two things is reversing the damage and developing projects that enable you to both keep what's there and get better with what's damaged. I'll talk more in a bit about increasing investment in nature-based solutions, but that for me is really fundamental. It's something I think in New Zealand we've got some research going under Sustainable Seas, and Drew's going to talk a bit more detail about that later. But how we invest more in some of these things that are not engineered solutions, that are using nature to clean nature or to improve nature. The role of private investment is something that's really poorly understood, but increasingly, I was at a responsible investment conference a couple of weeks ago, and this is basically a room full of bankers and KiwiSaver folk and whatnot. They were all talking about investing in nature. None of them really understood what they're talking about, and a lot of it was climate. But actually, when you're investing into climate, you're also seeing the benefits to biodiversity or water quality and to the people who live in those areas. The fact that you've got a room full of financial people even talking about this stuff shows how we are moving towards the mainstream with this sort of thing, which is great. Recognise also that restoring nature and decarbonisation are complementary things. It's not an either or, and people like the Responsible Investment Association talking about decarbonisation of the economy and climate change mitigation as if it's in a box over here, and it's not. It's part of everything. And if that's going to also lead to the biodiversity improvements that a lot of us have been chasing for a long, long time, and the water quality improvements that we just can't seem to find the political will or the money or whatever it is to do, then great, let's focus the narrative around the climate change piece, but recognise all of these other things that come with it. Okay, so those who are from within government, we've been talking to different parts of the public sector, both regional and national, for quite a few years about a lot of these sorts of things. And I think my main observation is that, and I hate to use the word government as a generic, but I don't think there's a very good understanding from within the public sector, be that regional or central, and this applies, I think, globally as well. What is our role here? And a lot of people, I mentioned before, that sort of lazy willingness to revert to the government needs to fix it, the government needs to pay for it, whatever it is really, really, I think, lazy and short-sighted. So just going across here, you've got government as a catalyst and an enabler is really important, and being willing to do things like supporting some feasibility studies or pilots that allow people to take chances, that sort of top part of the pyramid there where I mentioned before, do things differently. And some of the willingness, the government has a role there to take a chance, recognise that things may not succeed, but it's worth taking a chance, because if you don't try, you'll never know. There's a huge and increasing role that you're seeing with investing as a catalyst to enable Māori development in the marine economy, and there's some really great work happening at the moment, pre-treaty settlement in the Bay of Plenty that we're involved with, where the through Te Ahu Kaimoana and funding from MPI, the feasibility of different offshore aquaculture, looking at not just what could you do and does it make sense, looking on the land at how you develop the people to enable a future Māori-led aquaculture industry, and then thinking, there's the economics, how do you do it, can you make money, what does that look like so that one day you can be investable, but also weaving in the four well-beings to all of that, so that when these Māori organisations in that part of the country are making decisions about what they want to invest in the future, the government's actually had an incredibly important role in funding that and supporting it, without holding up a rule book and saying these are the only things we want you to look at. And so that's a really important role that I think is quite misunderstood. Central and regional government need to get better, as we all know, at being aligned on the same page. Data and knowledge, obviously government across the board holds an incredible amount of information, and I think we'll hear from Stats NZ in a few minutes. Probably talk a bit more about that. R&D is something I think we're doing pretty well here at the moment. We've got Sustainable Seas here, Callaghan and others do that. On the regulatory and policy side of things, it's not just the fact that we need the policy of the future, the regulatory settings of the future need to enable the sorts of things that you've got here. It's really hard, because when you're preparing your policy today, you don't know what's happening in 10 or 15 years, but the ability for things like restorative aquaculture, for example, to get traction as things stand today is really, really hard. Even if it's all for positive reasons, it's still got the same sets of rules that were, in the case of Waikato, prepared 20 odd years ago. And so you can't get through some of those barriers, which then inhibit the ability to innovate. Investment, I think, is fairly self-explanatory. There's quite a bit of that. Provincial Growth Fund under the previous government, the Sustainable Food and Fibre Futures Fund of MPI is an awesome example where there is an awful lot of grant funding going into some really cool stuff in the marine environment. The role of government in underwriting some things. So take that risk that enables the private sector to what they call crowding in. So if the government's willing to take a small risk, others will come in, and don't underestimate how important the private investors of the world look at the role of government in coming in early. There's a really strong attachment, I guess, that private investors have when the government says we think this is pretty good, and we'll put some money on the table for it. So there's a really important role there. I'll just keep moving because I'm conscious of time. Drew, you're going to talk a bit more about this project. This is one Sustainable Seas project, and I won't cover too much on it, but it's called Developing Restorative Economies. We're co-leading it with NIWA, with Drew Laura, so I'll let him focus on it. But the key thing here from our perspective is, when this started, we were thinking about, there are all sorts of really cool large and small projects all around this country that, if they could find a way of generating revenue, they don't always need to have their hands out for grant funding from either philanthropy or from government. And those who are involved in those small scale and not so small, like what Revive Our Golf is now, you know how hard it is, and you're constantly applying for grant funding. So how might we be able to find ways in which they can generate revenue so that enables them to do things without grant funding, or maybe supplemented by grant funding, but not sort of withdrawing that dependence. Kai Ika is a great example that a lot of people down in Wellington might not have heard of, but that's provided, I think, 130,000 kilos of kaimoana to Papatūānuku marae in the last few years. And it started with basically people at the wharves in Auckland, when the recreational boaties came in with fish, they're too lazy to fillet their own fish. And so for $3, you get your fish filleted, and it turns out that's about 38% of the fish. The rest of it is going to the marae and is feeding many, many people. And so that's a neat example of something that's small. They're looking to grow. How can they grow? How can they generate revenue? And so there's a bunch of ways in which they can do it without compromising on those core values, and that will enable them to get bigger, and it enables them to expand spatially to other cities, for example. This example is one that's really dear to my heart. We've been developing this. It's in the States. It's called Greenwave. So it's regenerative ocean farming. It started in coastal fishing communities in the northeast about just over 11 or 10 years ago, when the inshore fish stocks collapsed. No more lobster, no more cod, and you've got multi-generational fishing communities with no income. And so a guy called Bren Smith created this this organization called Greenwave that has been up and running and is explicitly designed to enable the small business owner, i.e. in this case, it's marine farming, it's multiple species, depending on what's appropriate, but protecting the rights of that small business owner to commercially succeed. We're adapting it for New Zealand. We won't have time to go into the detail here, but we've been adapting this for the last couple of years, and we're just starting now through some trials. Where it leads to here is obviously different to the States, but it will be a farmer-owned co-op. Greenwave always grows seaweed, and that's the big missing piece in New Zealand because there is no supply chain for seaweed. So we're building some hatcheries. We'll guarantee that farmers can access product from a hatchery at a fair price. We'll guarantee that the products that are grown on the water by those farmers can be sold at a fair price, and that de-risks it for the farmer. And I'm not trying to be anti-corporate, but it removes what happens inevitably in the seafood sector, where you have the consolidation and either control of parts of the supply chain or the consolidation of the small business owners, whether they be the original small quota owners or in the case of aquaculture, the small farmers end up getting consolidated. The person who does the most work and makes the least money is the farmer. So we're designing it explicitly so the farmer can succeed. And there's a big regenerative part to this as well. So looking at how we can explicitly build in the benefits beyond the financial is an incredibly important part of this. So this is all just getting up and running now. How's time been?
Just a few minutes.
Okay. Oh, cheapers. Okay. Last, real quickly here, there's some neat work in Waikato University in the Tauranga campus have brought over it's called Bioremediation, but it's basically using macroalgae in a freshwater context or seaweed to clean dirty water. They can achieve incredible things with different species of seaweed, and they've done this. It's been proven for quite a long time in Australia. They came over here a few years back. There's a trial just getting underway near the Waiho River where they'll be diverting some of the water out of the river, running it through effectively these big long bathtubs, growing, in this case, ulva sea lettuce, taking out the nutrients out of that water, returning it back in cleaner. It's just a pilot scale, but this is something where you have those discharges that are ending up in our oceans being able to be run through something like this. You generate revenue in this case by a price for nitrogen. So your take was you're extracting nitrogen out of the dirty water, and also you're growing seaweed, and you can do all sorts of cool things with seaweed, biostimulants, the fertilizer replacements, those sorts of things. So there's a big blue to green play in terms of applying products to our agricultural lands as well. So I'll stop there. It's probably enough, and ask questions.
We've just got just a few minutes for questions because we're running a bit behind time. Any questions, or do you want to ask perhaps in the tea break? Thanks, Nigel.
Really exciting stuff. Catherine Short from Te Moana. What's your sense at the moment of the whole credit space then? Carbon credits, nitrogen credit, this whole financing mechanisms type thing. What's your sense of where that is moving? Can we kick the Climate Commission? What needs to be kicked?
So the Climate Commission final report did acknowledge blue carbon as an opportunity for New Zealand. I think one of the misnomers or misunderstandings that people have, and I've heard it a lot, is that the ETS should be picking up blue carbon, but the ETS is one way, but it's slow moving. It's structured, it's regulated market, and so it's not bringing in something like seaweed anytime soon. If you look at all of those other things that have struggled to get into the ETS, but there are voluntary markets around the world. Blue carbon from seaweed, no one in the world has yet made $1 from a blue carbon credit, but the work we're doing with NIWA that Drew's going to talk a bit more about is doing some research to look at how we can develop those, and also the greenwave work that I mentioned before. A big chunk of that will be looking to develop the some blue carbon and nitrogen credits. So we're combining those because seaweed takes out both the nutrients and the carbon. That's it. Cool. Thank you.